Something trembled beneath the cobblestones of Downing Street this morning, and for once, it wasn't the usual chaos stirred up by a rebellious Tory backbencher or the latest tabloid exposé laying bare another political indiscretion. No, this time, the unrest came not from the opposition benches or a press office leak, but from within the very ranks of Sir Keir Starmer's own government. A low-profile agreement, once quietly trumpeted as a landmark in Britain's post-Brexit foreign policy, has rapidly unravelled into a full-blown political headache, and potentially an economic reckoning. What was meant to be a technical alignment in climate regulation has morphed, seemingly overnight, into a harbinger of higher energy bills, accusations of regulatory capitulation to Brussels, and mounting disillusionment from voters who were promised sovereignty, not silent retreat. At the heart of the row is a decision to link the UK's domestic carbon market, the UK Emissions Trading Scheme, ETS, with the European Union's far more stringent and expensive emissions system. The move, initially framed as a symbol of goodwill and cooperation, is now being heavily criticised as both economically reckless and politically tone-deaf. What's especially notable is that the warning bells weren't rung by fringe commentators, ideological Brexiteers, or opportunistic backbenchers, but by a respected energy expert with no political loyalties and no agenda beyond the numbers. Catherine Porter, an independent consultant long active in the UK's energy market, has provided a sobering assessment of the government's latest policy gamble. Her conclusion is unambiguous: this could prove one of Starmer's most costly political miscalculations yet. A quiet agreement with loud consequences. The UK ETS, like its European counterpart, is a market-based mechanism designed to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It works by capping the total level of carbon emissions permitted and allowing companies to trade carbon allowances within that cap. Firms that manage to reduce their emissions below the allowed limit can sell their surplus allowances to others who exceed theirs, creating a financial incentive to pollute less. On the surface, this sounds like a rational and progressive solution. And indeed, such schemes are considered essential tools in the fight against climate change. However, what is causing concern now is not the existence of the system itself, but the government's decision to tether the UK's version to the EU's, thereby importing a host of complications, not least of which is cost. The EU's carbon pricing is significantly higher than Britain's. By choosing to align the two systems, the UK is, in effect, volunteering to absorb those higher prices, not only for businesses operating within the energy and industrial sectors, but ultimately for millions of ordinary British consumers. The numbers behind the storm. According to estimates by Porter and others in the energy consultancy world, this alignment could result in upwards of £200 million in additional annual costs that will inevitably find their way onto the electricity bills of British households. In a country already grappling with inflation, stagnant wages, and increased living expenses, this could be the final straw for many families. Prior to this agreement, the UK had a surplus of carbon credits, thanks in part to reduced industrial output during the pandemic and the energy transition. This surplus acted as a buffer, helping to keep energy prices in check and offering British companies a slight edge in competitiveness. That buffer, however, will be effectively neutralised once the UK enters the EU's more expensive system, a move critics are calling an own goal, at a time when economic prudence should be paramount. Porter is frank in her assessment: there is little, if any, direct benefit to the British public in this alignment. The supposed advantages, she argues, largely political, symbolic gestures that do nothing to ease the financial burden on working households or support domestic industry. As she puts it, we're giving away a post-Brexit economic advantage in exchange for a pat on the back from Brussels. Symbolism and sovereignty. And herein lies the deeper, more contentious issue. This is not merely a debate over carbon pricing, it's a litmus test for Britain's post-Brexit identity. Starmer's government has framed the move as an act of diplomatic re-engagement, a signal that the UK is willing to collaborate closely with its European neighbours on climate issues. But to many, it feels like the thin edge of a wedge, a quiet return to regulatory alignment under the guise of pragmatism. For British industry, the implications are clear: higher operating costs, tighter compliance obligations, and a growing sense that policymaking is drifting away from domestic needs and toward continental norms. For families up and down the country, the message is no less stark: prepare for higher energy bills, and don't expect much in return. The symbolism is potent. In 2016, the UK voted to take back control. And yet, less than a decade later, decisions like this suggest a creeping reabsorption into the very frameworks Britain chose to leave. While Starmer's team may argue this is about responsible cooperation, to many observers, it looks suspiciously like capitulation. An expensive trade-off. The government has defended the move on the grounds of future-proofing the UK's export economy. Ministers point to the EU's forthcoming Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, CBAM, which will impose levies on imports from countries with lower environmental standards. The argument goes that by aligning now, the UK avoids those penalties later, protecting its exporters in the process. There is some truth in that logic. A report by Frontier Economics, commissioned by the energy sector itself, estimates that the alignment could save UK exporters roughly £770 million over 4 years. That might sound compelling. But when weighed against the projected £200 million per year in additional electricity costs to British consumers, the economic calculus becomes murky. Over the same 4-year period, British households could face nearly £800 million in extra costs, effectively cancelling out any trade benefit. And that's assuming energy prices remain stable, a risky assumption in today's volatile global markets. The reality is that the government's solution may simply shift the burden from one group of taxpayers to another, offering corporate relief at the expense of the average household. A cautionary tale in the making? If left unchecked, this decision could set a precedent for further realignments, slow, quiet concessions framed as diplomatic or environmental necessities, but which ultimately erode the economic and political autonomy that post-Brexit Britain was promised. Critics warn that this could be the first in a series of decisions that gradually tether the UK back to EU norms, regulations, and pricing structures, all without the political transparency or public consent that should accompany such a shift. In the end, the true cost of this policy may not be measured in pounds and pence alone. It may be the erosion of trust in a government that promised to steer a sovereign course, yet appears increasingly willing to sail back toward familiar continental waters, even if the tide carries a heavy price for those on shore. Over a 4-year period, British households stand to bear an additional £800 million in electricity costs, a figure that effectively nullifies any perceived economic gains from aligning the UK's carbon market with that of the European Union. This, by any rational standard, cannot be considered a sound economic strategy. It is, rather, a performance, a carefully choreographed gesture of political theatre aimed not at strengthening Britain from within, but at earning polite applause from abroad. Sir Keir Starmer's government appears increasingly preoccupied with appeasing Brussels and curating the optics of international cooperation, even if it means doing so at the expense of domestic resilience and consumer protection. In the pursuit of harmony with European institutions, the government seems willing to trade away hard-won regulatory independence, ignoring the mounting strain on British households already struggling under the weight of inflation, soaring energy bills, and economic stagnation. And herein lies a growing pattern. What we're witnessing is a model of governance that seems to prioritize external validation over internal welfare, leadership that looks outward for approval while turning a blind eye to the very real pressures facing families, workers, and businesses across the country. Far from delivering pragmatic leadership, this government is quietly committing Britain to long-term, rigid frameworks that erode national flexibility and compromise our ability to tailor policy to British needs. Policy without sovereignty. Perhaps the most troubling aspect of this emissions trading alignment is not merely the financial burden it imposes, but the loss of policy sovereignty it represents. By tying ourselves to the EU's emissions trading system, with its higher carbon prices, stricter targets, and slower responsiveness, we are surrendering our ability to shape a market regime that reflects our economic structure, our environmental priorities, and our investment climate. This is not just a regulatory detail. It is a seismic shift in who holds the reins of British policymaking. With this alignment, we are inheriting the EU's rulebook wholesale, regardless of whether those rules suit our national context. It's a one-size-fits-all model, and it's one that severely limits our ability to adapt, to innovate, or to recalibrate in response to emerging domestic challenges. Even more disconcerting is the lack of democratic transparency with which this decision has been taken. There has been no robust public debate, no substantial parliamentary scrutiny, and certainly no electoral mandate for this level of realignment with the European regulatory order. For a government that claims to be taking back control, such opacity is at best ironic, at worst a betrayal of the post-Brexit promise. Independence in name only. Far from demonstrating pragmatic diplomacy, this latest move has the hallmarks of a stealth retreat from the principles of Brexit, a quiet rollback of autonomy dressed up in the language of cooperation. Yet leading experts are beginning to challenge the narrative. Andy Meyer of the Institute of Economic Affairs has described the government's decision as a missed opportunity. According to Meyer, the UK had a chance to pursue a radically different path, one in which we could have slashed compliance costs, attracted foreign investment with a competitive carbon framework, and established an environmental strategy that balanced economic growth with climate responsibility. A chance, in short, to do things our own way. Instead, Starmer's administration has chosen to rebind the UK to Brussels, handing over policy control to foreign bureaucrats, while expecting the British public to foot the bill. In a moment where bold, imaginative leadership is required, what we've been given is a recycled strategy, built on a foundation of old obligations and new costs. Disorder in the skies, a mirror of national drift. As Britain's political class appears to surrender strategic ground on the policy front, our global image is also taking a battering in the cultural sphere. A recent EasyJet flight from London to Ibiza descended into chaos, capturing headlines for all the wrong reasons. British tourists, allegedly drunk and possibly under the influence of other substances before even boarding, transformed the flight into something resembling a flying nightclub. They shouted, sang, and behaved in a manner that left fellow passengers intimidated and appalled. One Spanish passenger, Erica Barracina, documented the incident and posted the footage online, where it swiftly went viral. She described the experience as an absolute horror. Her criticism, however, wasn't limited to the unruly passengers. She called into question the broader culture that enables this kind of behavior, a permissive, alcohol-fueled approach to tourism that has long plagued destinations like Ibiza. Her message was clear: passengers who behave like this shouldn't be allowed to board, let alone be served alcohol in the air. And her frustration is not hers alone. Across Europe, a growing backlash is building, not against tourism itself, but against the consequences of its unchecked expansion. In the Canary Islands, over 130,000 local residents took to the streets recently, protesting the explosion of short-term holiday lets, which they argue are pricing residents out of their homes. In Barcelona, tensions are also mounting, as citizens push back against the kind of tourism that disrupts communities, undermines local identity, and prioritizes profit over quality of life. The drunken Brit abroad, an unwanted stereotype. What was once heralded as a vital economic lifeline for Europe, the surge in British tourism, is increasingly being perceived as a social and cultural threat. And the image of the drunken Brit abroad is only fueling resentment. It's not just about a few bad apples. It's about the perception of a nation losing its grip, both at home and overseas. Whether we're talking about carbon deals inflating our bills, or airborne debauchery embarrassing our reputation, the same uncomfortable question keeps arising: who is actually looking out for Britain? At present, it feels as though no one in power truly is. Not when crucial decisions are made behind closed doors. Not when our national strategy is outsourced to foreign institutions. Not when the British identity abroad is reduced to a viral meme of chaotic excess. A moment for reckoning. The UK stands at a crossroads, not only in terms of its domestic policy, but also in how it projects itself to the world. Decisions like the ETS alignment are not mere administrative tweaks. They are signals that speak volumes about the direction in which we're heading. Are we building a post-Brexit Britain that is confident, sovereign, and adaptable? Or are we quietly drifting back into familiar dependencies, trading flexibility for false stability? The public deserves answers, and more importantly, a government willing to prioritize the national interest over political image building.